a legislative body, a continental congress for all 13 colonies, right? This is something that had been attempted before in the 1750s and even the 1760s, but had not really garnered the support of all 13 colonies, right? Even in this political cartoon, whatever you want to call it, you can see that we have South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and New England, which is like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and Georgia's not there, right? So there's even in this situation in the 1770s, there are colonies that are not necessarily sure what direction they want to move in with the other colonies. But there's a Continental Congress that is set up in 1774. In the book you'll read about, there's the first Continental Congress and then the second Continental Congress. Woo! And they have continental breakfast, and it's good. The first Continental Congress is set up in 1774 to protest, among other things, taxation, unjust taxation, right? This idea of taxation, taxes being passed by Parliament in England when the colonists don't have any members of Parliament. They don't vote on any members of Parliament. And they say in 1774 that if the demands, they want, a burden from taxes or various demands. And if those demands are not met by England, then they will have a second Continental Congress in 1775, which they do. They have, because their demands aren't being met, right? And so in the second Continental Congress, that's a real tongue twister, Continental Congress, 1775, they decide to form a Continental Army. And they decide to appoint George Washington as the general of that army, because George Washington he's a Virginian, so he's a Southerner, and they thought that would create unity among Northern and Southern colonies. He also has military experience from the 7 Years' War, right? And the 7 Years' War, in a lot of ways, is a big reason this revolutionary period comes about, because these 13 colonies, after the 7 Years' War, they all sort of fought with each other in these militias, right? They fought this war together with England, so they feel more unified after it. And then also the taxes that they're burdened with after this war are the result of debt that England finds itself in, because of the war. So they form a continental army. Not only do they form a continental army, but all of the 13 colonies start forming militias, right? Basically citizen soldiers, right? Citizens who organize as military units. And in order to do that effectively, they start stockpiling weapons, right? Getting a bunch of weapons and putting them in like an armory or, some place where there's a collection of weapons that are secured, like rifles and stuff, probably some cannon, just in, if they ever need to use them. And that actually happens. It's in April, like spring, summer of 1775. In Massachusetts, these two towns, Lexington and Concord, the British Army, which is present in the colonies now permanently, basically, find out that there are colonists who are stockpiling weapons, who are collecting weapons and storing them in this armory. It could have just been, I'm not sure if it was like just some building where they kept weapons. They found out they were stockpiling arms. So they went to seize those arms, right? Like they're going in. These people are organizing militias. They're using that for the specific purpose of fighting us. So we're going to go take those weapons. And so when they get to these towns, they are met by a group. There's like 500 British soldiers, and they are met by about 80 colonists. And there are shots fired. Right? The fire is exchanged between both groups, and that's considered the opening stages of the military conflict that's known as the American Revolution, right? Even though a Declaration of Independence has not even been signed yet, right? And even though a lot of people still are not necessarily convinced that there's a need to separate from England, right? They're actually have an army, a continental army. They're actually organizing as a group of colonies. They're actually fighting at this point against the British Army, but it's not a 100% certainty that this is going to lead to some sort of independence movement, right? Sure. Okay. So yeah, so that's considered the first. Those are considered the first shots of the revolution, even though there's no declaration yet. So
how many died though during that?
I'm not sure. There were about 80 colonists and 500 British soldiers. I think a handful on each side. And apparently the colonists it was like a militia group. They were told by whoever was leading them, this is what apparently they were told to wait, to not fire first and wait until you're fired upon. I find that hard to believe. If there's like 80 guys who are just regular dudes with guns, and these 500 redcoat dudes are showing up, I feel like the colonists probably would shoot first, right? I mean, you'd be like, they're getting a little closer.
They should, honestly.
Yeah. And the British, their experience with the colonists from the 7 Years' War is that these guys aren't disciplined at all. They're just a bunch of regular citizens. They don't have discipline. They're not good soldiers. Like, let's walk. We're gonna walk in there and just take these weapons, and then all of a sudden, like, bullets start whizzing by, and
I feel like they went easy on them, though. How do you lose?
Well, they didn't lose. They didn't lose. They didn't. That's a good point, though. It's like the numbers are. They didn't. They probably weren't expecting it. I don't think. And so, but a few people die on both sides. The first real battle is a place called Bunker Hill. It's actually not on Bunker Hill. It's on the hill that's next to Bunker Hill, but they call it. It's Bunker. It's just this because what people called it. I think they were on a different hill called like Breed's Hill, but they refer to it as Bunker Hill. So it was basically outside of Boston. The colonists were defending the city of Boston, and the British Army tries to take this hill as a strategic position so they can go occupy Boston. And they end up doing that. They end up taking this hill. Then they technically win the battle, and then they end up. I don't know why I put that in quotes. They technically win the battle, and then they occupy Boston. But they end up losing twice as many soldiers. They have twice as many casualties as the colonists do in this battle. So even though they win, there's a huge loss of life that nobody was anticipating, right? It boosts the morale of the colonists because they see, even though we lost this battle, look at the damage we inflicted, against the most powerful army in Europe, basically. At the end of 1775, this guy he's the Earl of Dunmore. He's the royal governor of Virginia. He actually issues a proclamation to slaves in Virginia that if you escape from your owners and come behind British lines and fight with the British, you will gain your freedom, right? And so you end up with a situation where this is what makes the Revolutionary War somewhat complicated, right? Because you have as the sort of the figurehead of this revolution for a lot of people is George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, who writes the Declaration of Independence, right? And they're arguing for the equality of all people and freedom and liberty and the pursuit of happiness and all these things. And yet 17 of Washington's slaves, he owns hundreds of people. 17 of them actually escape and go fight with the British. They're actually remaining loyal to the British for their freedom, right? For like a freedom that's definitely more substantial, right? It's not just about taxes and being able to own land in the West. It's about actual like freedom from slavery. So in their eyes, freedom is with the British. And you end up with a situation where 20,000 slaves end up fighting with the British and British loyalists and for their freedom, right? And you have eventually the American side offers freedom. Some colonies, not all, most northern colonies offer freedom in some form to slaves for fighting, and about 5,000 slaves fight on the side of the Americans. So they're on both sides. This is arguably in many ways it's a civil war, right? There are as many loyalists as there are people who are what we call patriots or support the American side. The Iroquois Confederacy, right, which is a group of 6 Indian nations, they split apart over this Revolutionary War because about 4 of the different nations side with the British, 2 side with the Americans, right? And then you have slaves who are on both sides, right? So there's all sorts of different factors.